Good morning, all of you. We will continue with Mother's Day, and today we will start from page number 47. Open your books to page number 47, Snapshots, page number 47, chapter number 5, Mother's Day. Okay, what is this play about? Anyone?
Ma'am, ma'am, Mrs. Fitzgerald and Mrs. Pearson changed their spirit, ma'am, because Mrs. Fitzgerald, ma'am, ma'am Pearson was, ma'am, very loving, ma'am, caring, ma'am. Ma'am, she was always thinking about her family and not at all about her. So, ma'am, Fitzgerald and Pearson changed their spirits, and ma'am, now Mrs. Pearson was very, ma'am, rude.
Okay, okay, tell me one thing. Why do they change places? They change places, okay, we know. They change their bodies, change their spirits, but why do they do that?
To make my family realize how to treat her.
Okay, because here the chief character of the play, the chief protagonist of the play is Mrs. Annie Pearson. All right, she's the mother and wife who is not treated well by her family, and so what happens that they both, Mrs. Fitzgerald, who is the neighbor and also the fortune teller, both of them, they change their bodies, they change their spirits, and so then all this is done because Mrs. Fitzgerald, in the beginning of the play, she tells Mrs. Annie Pearson that now you need to take a stand, means you need to stand up for yourself and teach your family, and you already are telling me that they are spoiled, so now you need to take a stand. But Mrs. Annie Pearson, she's a very soft natured lady and she's fond of her family also, and so she says that even if I promise, I don't think so I'll be able to keep my word. And so Mrs. Fitzgerald says, okay, then you let me do it. And then both of them, they change their spirits, and now Mrs. Annie Pearson, who otherwise was very soft and nervous kind of lady, now she becomes bold and dominating, and Mrs. Fitzgerald, now since she has Mrs. Annie Pearson's spirit, so now she becomes nervous type. And then Mrs. Annie Pearson, with Mrs. Fitzgerald's spirit, now she sets to put the family members each in their place. All right, and that is the process we are doing. So we have already seen the interaction between Doris and Mrs. Annie Pearson, Cyril and Annie Pearson, and also we have seen that seen George also come in, the husband, and so till that place we have done. And now we have seen that in the beginning, Mrs. Annie Pearson with Mrs. Fitzgerald body, she tells Mrs. Fitzgerald with Mrs. Annie Pearson spirit that okay, later on you come, for as of now you go, and later on you come and see that how things are going. So yesterday we have simply started ended at that particular portion that Mrs. Fitzgerald, she comes in to find out that how things are going. Okay, and so Mrs. Fitzgerald, she says, I just wondered if everything is all right. And so Cyril says that no, everything is not all right. And so Mrs. Pearson, she says, of course it is, and you be quiet. And now Cyril, he gets angry and he's like, why should I be quiet? And Mrs. Pearson, she shouts and says, because I am telling you to be quiet, and you silly, spoiled young pecan, and that is foolish person. And so Mrs. Fitzgerald, she protests on it because Mrs. Pearson was scolding Cyril, and so she says, oh no, surely. But Mrs. Pearson, she cuts her severely and says, now Mrs. Fitzgerald, you let me manage my family in my own way, please. Okay. And to that Mrs. Fitzgerald, she says, but yes, but Cyril, and she addresses Cyril with his first name, and with no proper term of addressing. And so Cyril says he does not like it, and he says it is Mr. Cyril Pearson, to you Mrs. To you please Mrs. Fitzgerald. And there they follow the proper means of addressing other people whom you don't know very well, means your only the family members and friends, they call each other with first name on first name basis. Otherwise, with proper way of addressing, people address each other. And because Mrs. Fitzgerald is just a neighbor, and so obviously she shouldn't have called Cyril just Cyril, but all as Mr. Cyril or as Mr. Cyril Pearson. And so that is why Cyril, he does not like it. And so then still Cyril, saying that, he goes on to the kitchen, and Mrs. Fitzgerald, now she moves to the settee where Mrs. Annie Pearson was sitting, and says that, oh dear, what's happening? So Mrs. Pearson, she's very calm, and she says, nothing much. I'm just putting them back in their places, that's all. And I'm simply doing what you ought to have done long since. And so Mrs. Fitzgerald, she asks that, is George home? And and then she sits beside Mrs. Pearson on the settee, and Mrs. Pearson replies that yes, and I have been telling him that I have already told him that what the people think about him at the club. And so Mrs. Fitzgerald, she says, well, they think a lot about him, means they think that yes, he is good and and important enough. So Mrs. Pearson, no, they don't, and now he knows it. And so now Mrs. Fitzgerald, because she has Mrs. Annie Pearson's spirit, so she gets nervous. Oh dear, I wish you hadn't told Mrs. Fitzgerald. So Mrs. Pearson is like, nonsense, I'm all doing them a lot of good, and they'll be eating out of your hand soon, means they'll do everything you say. So Mrs. Fitzgerald say that I don't want them to eat out of my hand. All right. And so Mrs. Pearson, now she is getting impatient, says, well, whatever you want, that they will do. All three of them. Mark my words, Mrs. Pearson. So she says that, okay, it does not matter what you want them to do, but whatever you want, now all three of them will do just that. And that on that, George, he enters from the left. He is glum, he is sad, and he is surprised, but in an unpleasant manner. He is not happy to see the visitor, and he does not even wish the visitor. He simply moves to the armchair which is on the left, and he sits down there heavily and glumly lights his pipe. So he sits down there with a thud, and then he lights his pipe. And then he looks from Mrs. Pearson to Mrs. Fitzgerald, who is regarding, and Mrs. Fitzgerald, now she is looking at Mr. Pearson in a very worried, anxious manner. And so that is why George, he looks from one to another, means from Mrs. Pearson to Mrs. Fitzgerald. And George, he asks that, just looked in for a minute, I suppose, Mrs. Fitzgerald, that I think you are just looking in for a minute. So Mrs. Fitzgerald, she is not realizing, she does not realize what she is saying, and she says, well, yes, I suppose so, George, means she forgot that she is in Mrs. Fitzgerald's body, and so obviously she cannot address George as just George. Alright, now she had to address him as Mr. George Pearson, but she totally forgot what she was saying, and she says, well, yes, I suppose so, George. And Mrs. Fitzgerald and George is like, he is George, means how can you call me that? And Mrs. Fitzgerald, again, she is getting nervous. She says, oh, I'm sorry. And Mrs. Pearson, on that, she gets impatient and says that, what does it matter? Means, why you getting so puffed up? It is all right. Your name is George, isn't it? And who do you think you are? Are you the Duke of Edinburgh? Means, who do you think you are? That you should be called like with Mr. George Pearson. Is it okay? Your name is George, and she's calling you as George. So no big deal. And now George, he got angry and says that, what he's got to do with it? Means this Duke of Edinburgh and all, what he's got to do with all this? And just tell me that. And then he says, isn't it already bad enough? What means what I have witnessed today? Isn't it already bad enough? Other than she also calling me George, and already no tea, you didn't get me any tea ready. Then this everything about Pompey Pearson, and then Doris also, you have made Doris also cry. And so it is already so much for today, and on top of that she is calling me George. Okay, I want someone to read now. Come on, Simmer, read from page 48.
Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Fitzgerald. Oh dear, I ought to have known. George, staring at her annoyed. You ought to have known. Why ought you to have known? Nothing to do with you, Mrs. Fitzgerald. Look, we are at sixes and sevens here just now, so perhaps you'll excuse us.
Okay.
Mrs.
All right.
Pearson.
Okay, wait. So when George says that everything is wrong here, and the way you have been talking and behaving, and then she calling me George, and then you haven't got any tea ready, and calling me Pompey Pearson, and then you have made Doris cry, and she's crying her eyes out upstairs, and so Mrs. Fitzgerald, when she hears all this, she says, "Oh, I ought to have named, means I should have known that Mrs. Fitzgerald will do this." And George, he is he stares at her, he is angry. Means why would the neighbor know? And he says, "You ought to have known." Then why you ought to have known? Means obviously it is not your matter. It is happening, something is happening in my family. Why should you ought to have known that? And he says, it has nothing to do with you, Mrs. Fitzgerald. And then he says that, look, at this point we are at sixes and sevens. Sixes and sevens here means we are in a disagreement here. So there's disagreement going on in the house and confusion going on in the house right now. So it will be better if you'll please excuse us. What it means is, it's a polite way of saying that as of now you please go back home. Yes, continue.
Mrs. Pearson, before Mrs. Fitzgerald can reply. I won't excuse you, George Pearson. Next time a friend and neighbor comes to see me, just say something when you see her. Good evening, or how do you do? Or something. Don't just march in and sit down without a word. It's a bad manner.
All right. So,
Mrs. Fitzgerald.
okay, wait. So, Mrs. Pearson, she does not say anything. She does not reply to what George says, but says before Mrs. Fitzgerald could even reply. So, she says to George that, George Pearson, I won't excuse it. This is the first and the last time. Next time, I'm not going to excuse you. And next time, a friend or a neighbor, if any friend or neighbor comes to see me, then when you see her, then you need to say something good, like good evening, or how do you do. And never again you will simply just march in without saying a word, and that is not right, because it is bad manners. Yes.
Mrs. Fitzgerald nervously, sorry. No, it's all right. Mrs. Pearson, no, it isn't all right. We have some decent manners in this house, or I'll know the reason why. Glaring at George. Well, George, intimidated. Well, what? Mrs. Pearson, taunting him. Why don't you get off to your club? Special night tonight, isn't it? They'll be waiting for you, wanting to have a good laugh. Go on then. Don't disappoint them.
All right. Okay. So when Mrs. Pearson, she tells George that it is bad manners and never again you will do something like that. And so Mrs. Fitzgerald, she's like, no, no, it's all right, Mrs. Pearson. But she says, no, it's not all right. And now from now onwards, we'll have some decent, proper manners in this house, or I'll know the reason why. And she stares at George, and George is like, well, what? So Mrs. Pearson, she again taunts him and says that, why don't you go to your club? Special night tonight. Don't you remember? And you go off, because they'll be waiting to have a good laugh at you, because you are one of their standing jokes. So only when you will go, then they will have a laugh at you. So she says, okay, they'll be waiting for you. Now go on, don't disappoint them. All right. And so on that, what does George say? Who will read now? Prisha, will you read? Yes, Prisha.
Yes, ma'am.
हाँ बेटा read. Come on. Some problem at your end? Gaurav? Gaurav? Can you hear me? Am I audible to you?
Yes, ma'am.
हाँ बेटा you read.
Yes, ma'am. Uh, Mrs. Pearson, why don't you get off to your club? Special night tonight is not it. They will be waiting for you, wanting to have a good laugh. Go on then, don't disappoint. M. George. That's right. Make me look silly in front of her now. Go on, don't mind me. Sixes and sevens. Poor Doris been crying her eyes out, getting the neighbors in to see the fun, suddenly losing his temper, glaring at Mrs. Pearson and shouting, "All right, let her hear it. What's the matter with you? Have you gone barmy or what?"
Okay. And
Miss
so wait. Uh, when Mrs. Pearson she taunts John and says that why you are not going to the club? Go, they want to have a good laugh at you, so you don't disappoint them. And George, he does not like it and he's bitter about it and says, "That's right. Now you're making me look silly in front of her also now. Okay, go on. Don't mind me. Means it is okay. You don't have any concern for me. Now you're making a fool of me in front of the neighbor also." And sixes and sevens means again he talks about disagreement. And then poor Doris, she has been crying her eyes out, means she has been crying so much. And now you want to see the neighbors, now you want to have to see the neighbors also, all that is going on in our house, you also want them to have fun at our cost. And then suddenly he loses his temper and his glares means very hard, giving a he gave a very hard look at Mrs. Pearson, and he shouts that, "All right, then let her also hear it. What is the matter with you? You tell. Have you gone balmy? Means have you got mad, crazy, insane?" Yes. Read. Gaurav, continue.
Mrs. Pearson, jumping up savagely, if you
Savagely.
shout at me savagely, if you shout at me again like that, George Pearson, I will slap your big, fat, silly face. Mrs. Fitzgerald, meaning, oh no, 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 please. Mrs. Fitzgerald, Mrs. Pearson said. George, staring at her, uh, bewildered.
Bewildered.
Uh, Either I am off my chump or you two are. How do you mean? No, no, please. Mrs. Fitzgerald, look, you are Mrs. Fitzgerald. So why are you telling yourself to stop when you are not doing anything? Tell her to stop. Then there will be some sense in it. Staring at Mrs. Pearson. I think you must be tidily.
Tiddly.
Tiddly.
Okay.
Mrs. Pearson.
All right. Okay, wait. So, George, he loses his temper and he shouts and say at Mrs. Pearson and says that, okay, then let her also hear it. And you tell what is wrong with you. Have you gone mad, crazy, insane? And at that, Mrs. Pearson, she very wildly savage, in a very savage manner, she jumps up and says, "If you shout at me like that again, George Pearson, then I will give you a very I will give you a slap on your big fat face." And when Mrs. Fitzgerald she hears, she's like, "Oh no, 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 please, Mrs. Fitzgerald." At this moment again, she is forgetting that she is in Mrs. Fitzgerald body, so she cannot call Mrs. Annie Pearson as Mrs. Fitzgerald, because right now she herself is Mrs. Fitzgerald. And so when she says that, "Oh no, Mrs. Fitzgerald," so Mrs. Annie Pearson she sits. But George, he stares at her bewildered. He's confused and he's like, either I am off my chump, means either I am out of my mind, crazy, insane, or both of you are mad. And then he asks Mrs. Fitzgerald that, "How do you mean no, no?" Means, why are you saying that no, no, please, Mrs. Fitzgerald? And he says that, "Look, you are Mrs. Fitzgerald, and why are you telling yourself to stop?" Means, why are you asking yourself to stop? You are not doing anything. Now you should ask her to stop. Mrs. means Mr. Annie Pearson. And if you ask her to stop, then obviously there'll be some sense in it. Because you yourself are Mrs. Fitzgerald. You are doing nothing. And then you are saying, "Oh, oh, Mrs. Fitzgerald, stop it." You should ask Mrs. Pearson, means my wife, to stop. And then only there'll be some sense in it. And then, he stares at his wife and says, I think you must be tiddly. Tiddly means slightly drunk. So then he asked that, I think now you are little drunk. So at that, Mrs. Pearson, she again start up savagely, say that again, George Pearson. And George now he's intimidated and he is, threatened, and he's like, all right, means no, okay, I'm not saying anything more. And at that, Doris, she enters from the left slowly, and she is looking miserable because she has been crying so much, and she is still wearing the wrap because she was to go out with Charlie Spence, and so she is still wearing the wrap. And Mrs. Pearson, she sits on the settee. So Mrs. Fitzgerald, when Doris comes in, so she says, hello Doris dear. So Doris is like, hello Mrs. Fitzgerald. And so Mrs. Fitzgerald says that, I think you were going out with Charlie Spence tonight. So again, she forgets that she should not be asking such personal questions. And why? Because she is in the body of the neighbor right now. And so Doris, she is angry. She says that, what you have got to do with that? Means whether I go out with Charlie Spence or not, or whether I had to go out with him, it is not concerning you. And what is that to do with you? So Mrs. Fitzgerald, she says, stop that. She scolds Doris, and so Mrs. Fitzgerald, no, it's all right. So Mrs. Pearson again, very severely scolding Doris. She says, no, it isn't all right, and I don't want to have a daughter who talks to anybody in that manner. And then, she says, okay, now you answer. She tells Doris, now you answer Mrs. Fitzgerald in a proper manner, or if you are not able to talk properly, then it is better you go upstairs to your room. And Doris, she looks wonderingly at her father, means, see, what is this happening, and why is mother behaving like this? And so George, in despair, he has no hope left now, and he's like, don't look at me, I give up, I just give up. Like you say, no, okay, now don't say anything to me, all right, don't expect anything from me, and I give up. And so Mrs. Pearson, again, she is being fierce with Doris and says, well, answer her. And Doris, uh, though she doesn't want, and then she says, okay, I was going out, I had to go out with Charlie Spence tonight, but now I won't be going, I have called that off, now I won't be going. And so Mrs. Fitzgerald, oh, what a pity dear, why have you? So she asked that, okay, why? That is so bad to and why are you not going? So Doris, now with a flash of temper, getting angry, she says, because if you must know, means if you really want to know, my mother being going on making me feel miserable and saying he's got buck teeth and is half-witted. And so she says to Mrs. Fitzgerald in a very again angrily, and says that, okay, if you really must know, then my mother, now she is in the process, making me, means she is in the process of making me feel miserable. She wants to make me feel bad, she is in the process of making me feel bad. And then she tells me that he's got buck teeth. I told you earlier, buck teeth means, those people who have their front teeth out and protruding onto their lower lips. And so Mrs. Annie Pearson, she talks about Charlie Spence, that he has got buck teeth and he is half-witted, means he's a very foolish person, very stupid person. And so she says, okay, that is why I'm not going, because my mother has called him buck teeth and half-witted. And so Mrs. Fitzgerald, now, she rather boldly, otherwise, she has a timid personality, not a bold personality. She's timid and nervous, but now rather boldly, she says to Mrs. Pearson, oh, you shouldn't have said that. And Mrs. Pearson, very sharply, she replies, Mrs. Fitzgerald, you let me manage my family and you manage yours. And so George, he says, taking her off now, are you any? Means now you're fighting with her, now you're giving her also that same thing. So Mrs. Pearson, now, she gets grim and says, again she says, they are waiting for you at the club, George, don't forget, and don't you start crying. And so, again she reminds George that, okay, go to the club, they must be waiting for you to come so that they can have a good laugh at you. And then she says to Doris, okay Doris, now you stop crying, don't cry anymore. And so Mrs. Fitzgerald, on that, she gets up and she makes a certain decision, and with that she gets up and says, that's enough, quite enough. And both George and Doris, they look at her confused, bewildered. Means, what is this going on? Means, what? A neighbor has come in, your family is fighting, and then she in that behaves like, okay, now enough, that's enough. So obviously both of them were shocked, and they look at her in that manner. Okay, so that is all the time we have for today. Have all of you understood what we are doing? Is it clear to all of you?
Yes,
Yes,
ma'am.
ma'am.
Yes.
All right.
Ma'am,